Massive demonstrations again in Hong Kong, thousands marching through the streets. Since the protests started last week, the entire city's been brought to a standstill. So what's going on here? Well, Hong Kong, it's essentially a limited democracy inside China's communist regime. Their constitution describes it as one country, two systems. And on the surface, these protests are about a new law that would allow people in Hong Kong to be extradited to face trial in China. That bill's now been suspended indefinitely because of this uproar, but those protests continue. And all of this is happening at a time when China is clearly in the mood to flex its muscles. So this is less about a single law than about growing Chinese influence, not just in Hong Kong, but around the world. Just look at what's going on with Canada. China still has 2 Canadian citizens detained, and they're not backing down. This week, CBC News discovered that China won't even take our calls anymore unless and until we release Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou. She, of course, was arrested in Vancouver following an extradition request from the United States. And China's relationship with the U.S. clearly isn't any better. Just this week, Trump told reporters that China, quote, ate the U.S. alive on the trade front during the Obama years and that he's had enough of it. Now, these all may appear like separate issues, but they're all part of the same story. And that story is about power, and it's been brewing for decades now. Here's a quick flashback to 2006.
A year and a half ago, I went to Wall Street in New York, and I told them I just launched an auction site called Taobao to compete with eBay. All the people were shocked. They said, "Jack, you are crazy."
That's Jack Ma, the owner of Alibaba, interviewed as part of the CBC series China Rises. Well, clearly they've risen quite a bit since then. Alibaba's platform, Taobao, now has 3 times more active users than eBay and Amazon. And that's just one example. Fast forward, China's now leading the next tech frontier. 5G networks will make phones faster, power smart cities, and get driverless cars on the road, and Huawei is leading the way. The US is waging a fierce campaign against Huawei, banning it from its own 5G networks, and trying to get its allies, like Canada, to do the same. There are growing concerns that China's using Huawei technology to spy on people, and now Huawei says it's signed 5G contracts in more than 30 countries, including Russia, which just signed on this week. Now, China's previous leader had a more lay-low international strategy, but when President Xi Jinping took over, he told the country a new era was coming. And technology isn't the only tool he's using. China's also putting shovels in the ground around the world. Another huge part of that plan called the Belt and Road Initiative. So what is China's Belt and Road Initiative? Simply put, it is the most ambitious infrastructure project on Earth, often referred to as the 21st century Silk Road. This initiative is a state-backed campaign for global influence. Think the US Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe after World War II, but way bigger. Tagged by China as One Belt, One Road, that really says it all. Belt refers to land corridors and road to marine shipping lanes, all with a view to connect the global economy to China. Beijing is currently building or planning to build in more than 65 countries along those routes. That's like 2/3 of the world's population. The project is expected to cost as much as $8 trillion with incredible gains for China. One branch already bearing fruit is the increased use of Chinese currency on the world stage. In the past 3 years alone, Malaysia's use of Chinese currency grew by 551%, Russia's by 56%, and Thailand's by 50%. The Belt Road Initiative was first unveiled in 2013 by President Xi Jinping, and since, China has spent big bucks in the countries along its path. Now, we're talking about railway, roads, ports, and power plants, but this is much more than a pathway. I mean, the Philippines is converting an old American military base into a full-fledged city funded by China. This is the world's fastest growing economy, extending its reach, or as critics would say, extending its control. While some applaud the spending, it has many people worried, prompting accusations of so-called debt trap diplomacy. The fear that China will use unpaid debt to gain economic and political sway. Already, countries like Sierra Leone, Malaysia, Nepal, and Sri Lanka have canceled some Chinese-backed projects. The estimated completion for this grand project, 2049, that just happens to be the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of of China. Now, another big part of this, of course, is surveillance. It's no secret the Communist Party monitors its citizens. But now China's also exporting that equipment to developing countries, selling its authoritarian vision along with it. And all of that tech is made by either Huawei or a Chinese state-run company. So in theory, China could have access to more than 1 billion people's information, not just in China, but in Ecuador, Venezuela, and beyond. The message is increasingly clear. America's influence seems to be falling, while China's quest for global power is accelerating. And it now has the world's fastest growing economy to back it up. Joining me now to talk about all this is freelance journalist Melissa Chen. She was Al Jazeera's Beijing correspondent until the Chinese state revoked her press credentials. She joins us now from Berlin. Now, Melissa, can we look at what's happening in Hong Kong as an example of an expansionist China that's looking to exert its influence, not just at home or even just in Hong Kong, but really around the world?
Well, we're certainly starting to feel that. Even just when I left China a number of years ago, people weren't really looking at China and its impact around the world. Now in the press in Canada, in North America, around the world, people are writing about what China is doing in each country, China's impact in the United States, China's impact in the regional area in Asia. And so, yes, you absolutely can put this all in context. Here is a country much more confident than it was a few years ago. And here is a new president, of course, and not that new, but it's certainly a passing of the leadership. And we saw this pivot, really, in terms of what this president wants from the previous president, Hu Jintao, who was much more of a status quo guy. And now you have an ambitious leader who wants China to be consolidated with Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the far west, as I mentioned, but also, of course, flexing its muscle around the world, having an impact on a lot of small countries as well as big ones.
Right, and the big one that we hear about all the time is the United States and the trade dispute there. And you can sort of see on the one side, the United States seems to think this is just a trade dispute about how much you're going to buy and how much you're going to sell, whereas increasingly we're hearing from Merrill Lynch, for example, that China sees this as a technological arms race, that it wants to sell its surveillance equipment, it wants to expand its technological prowess in the world, expand its 5G networks. Is the truth somewhere between the two, or is the United States kind of misreading what China wants out of those talks?
I think that you've really hit it on the head. It is a little bit of both, frankly. I mean, the Chinese stand to benefit when they sell their, for example, the surveillance equipment around the world. I was in Ecuador last year looking at just this kind of impact. And their strategy is different. Whereas you have a company in the United States that wants to sell something overseas, that company has to try to just do its sales pitch. With the Chinese, it comes with a sort of a public-private partnership, and frankly, not entirely public-private. Sometimes these companies are state-owned enterprises, so it's more public-public. And what they do is they approach a country, say, we want to sell something to you. A country says, I can't afford this. Well, oh, by the way, here's a Chinese bank who'll give you the loan. You don't have that kind of setup in Canada or the United States. It just doesn't work that way. And so the Chinese have an advantage. A country isn't sure how they're going to finance something. Well, here's the bank and here's the product. It's very simple. And then, of course, that leads into the politics of it, of course, is once you have a country putting up as collateral in case they can't return that money, like in Ecuador, it's oil. Suddenly you have a situation where China has a lot of leverage over Ecuador if it wants to exercise it.
So amidst all this shift in geopolitics, I wonder how you see Canada fitting in. I mean, we injected ourselves firmly in the middle of the U.S.-China dispute when we arrested the CFO of Huawei. Now, Canadian consular officials can't even get their phone calls returned in Beijing. How does Canada get its relationship with China sorted out? And do we need the U.S.-China relationship to get sorted before we can even get our issues on the table?
Oh, I think that's a really tricky one, but certainly Canada has found itself on the front lines in a very difficult way for Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. These two Canadians, of course, I'm sure everyone in Canada has been following this very closely. In China, finding themselves, again, this is a country with no rule of law or very little of it, and certainly not the ones we're familiar with, and putting it in the context of what's been happening over the past few days in Hong Kong and the extradition and the impact it's going to have. This is a bill that's not just going to impact Hong Kong citizens. Foreigners in Hong Kong could potentially be extradited to China. And so there are 300,000 Canadians in Hong Kong. This has been discussed. And these are potentially vulnerable people. And you have a situation where, especially with the U.S. and China, it looks like there's a tit-for-tat war going on, where unfortunately 2 Canadian nationals have been caught up in it in China. In Hong Kong, it's still run with rule of law and British common law. And so you have a situation where potentially people can be taken from that system in Hong Kong, moved up to China, where they would be in the kind of situation these 2 Canadians are in today.
With your experience, having been on the ground and watched and reported on this file, I wonder what your concern is. I mean, what is the worst case scenario as we sort of tie a bow on all these different stories that really do, sort of come together?
I think it's really hard to say. China is rising, and a lot of people are concerned. A lot of people are unsure about its motivations, and frankly, no one really does know. It is not a transparent government. And one lens through which a lot of people are starting to see this situation in the policy world, especially in the United States, it is an ideological battle between an authoritarian country exporting surveillance technology and in some ways exporting authoritarianism. If you look at Chinese history, through many thousands of years, it has been a nation that has been a force to reckon with. It has been a big country with a lot of impact. And frankly, for the past couple of 100 years, it has been abnormal that China has been fairly weak. So what we're seeing right now is a country that perceives itself as going back to its normal stasis, which is one that is going to have global impact.